I'd like to thank you all for coming tonight. My name is John Gray, and I'm the president of Historic Frankfort. And as most of you know, Historic Frankfort is a local group interested in preservation and history. And tonight we're going to have the second of our fall lecture series, and Jim Wallace is going to talk to us about what used to be the bottom area of Frankfort. Before we turn this over to Jim, though, I did want to also to tell you all that for Frankfort's bicentennial, which was in 1986, Historic Frankfort published this book, which is Capital on the Kentucky. And for those of you that have seen it, it's an illustrated history of Frankfort and Franklin County. And we collected hundreds of photographs and negatives during the publishing of this book. Not all of those negatives and photographs made it into the book, so we have quite a collection of photographs and negatives. And that was 6 years ago, and we really haven't done anything with those photographs and negatives in the last 6 years. And we think that what we ought to do with them is have them archived and protected and stored somewhere, like at the Historical Society or the Paul Sawyer Library or Library and Archives, so that future generations can have access to this collection. And I had asked Diane Bryant to come tonight. She was interested in this lecture, but she's also an archivist from Library and Archives, and she's the person that's actually going to help us do this archives project. So I would just ask Diane to stand up, and so you all can see who she is. Right now, Jim Wallace of the Historical Society has been working on a project where he's been interviewing people and collecting information on what used to be called the Craw area, or the bottom area of Frankfort. It was the victim of urban renewal 10 or 20 years ago, and Jim is about finished with his project, and when I heard about it, I thought that it would make an interesting lecture for the community and was something that Historic Frankfort and the members of Historic Frankfort would be interested in. So I had asked Jim over a year ago if he would put this together and speak to us. So I've had him on our agenda for a year, and the time has finally come. And Jim told me that he finally finished his presentation at 4:30 this afternoon. So I'll now turn this over to Jim Wallace.
What do you expect from me? Normally, I'm not particularly nervous about giving a talk, and I'm very pleased to give this talk because I worked on it for a long time. But I am a little bit more nervous tonight than I would be otherwise, not because of the number of people that are here or because who they are, but there's issues of proximity and issues of content that have sort of got me a little concerned. Normally when I give a talk, I'm 150 miles away from home, and by the time they can form a posse, I'm halfway back to Frankfort. And I'll never see those people again 9 times out of 10. And then content is a concern as well. You ask yourself, why are there so many people here tonight? What is it about the bottom, or Craw, that makes it so memorable, so special, so sensitive to some people? And there's a couple of reasons for that. You people, many of them here tonight, you folks have lived this story. And it's a complicated and an intricate story. And it's easy to make mistakes. That article that came out in Sunday's paper, several people said, oh, that's a nice article. Well, first of all, I forgot to mention the First Baptist Church, which had a major, major role in supporting and sustaining people down in the bottom. And second of all, I had a lady call me, very nice lady, and she said, you know, Mr. Wallace, white people lived in the bottom too. And so, I said, yes, I understand. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to give you the impression. I didn't know that. But what so often happens is history is not a real science. I put a little announcement in the Senior Citizens newsletter, said anybody has any remembrances, if you'd like to help me. And Henrietta Gill, I don't know if she's here tonight, but she called, and she gave me the names of 30 African Americans. And so I got launched. And I've done about 24 interviews, mostly with African Americans, but I have interviewed a number of white folks as well. And so that's really why maybe it seems like I might be dwelling a little bit on the African American side of things. The other thing that makes this story a little bit sensitive is, well, normally when I do research, it's on agricultural history in the antebellum era, which is the early 1800s. And there's very, very few 150-year-old cows that are going to leap up and contest you about anything. But you people, if I'm wrong, I want to know. I want to hear about it. Just wait till after the show and come over to me real quietly and say, "You're wrong. You're wrong, wrong, wrong. It wasn't that way. This is the way it was." And I would very much appreciate it because it would be helpful to me, very helpful to me. The other thing about content is, which story do you tell? Which story and from whose perspective? Well, let's keep it simple. Let's stay with urban renewal. 1955, 1972, real short period of time. Well, let's hear what some of the residents have to say about urban renewal. And I'm going to quote from what they told me. I'm not going to identify who gave me the material, and I'll tell you why. Because when I put this together, I didn't think I was going to do a public presentation, and I feel like it might be a violation of trust to name the person who gave me the quote. If you want to do some research, all the transcripts of all my interviews are going to be up at Kentucky State University and also at the Kentucky Historical Society under the care of the Oral History Commission. So if I quote something and it sounds interesting to you and you want to know more about it, well, you can go and get the transcripts and do some research yourself. But I think people gave me more than information. They gave me their trust, and trust is a fragile thing, and I don't want to break trust. So, okay, let's stick with urban renewal. By the way, if there's an obscenity used, I will use it. I don't want to offend anybody, but I feel like I've got to be honest to what was said to me. I went to one meeting, and this is about a public hearing on urban renewal, and got insulted. My landlord was Ernest Wooldridge, and I got up on the floor and I made a statement. I thought this urban renewal was a good thing. A lot of people needed help. There was sub-houses down there that people had to live in and didn't have nowhere else to live. And if we look at it that way, it might help get us better houses. And Mr. Wooldridge let me know real quick, you ain't got a word to say about this. You don't own nothing down there. One simple story, two completely opposite perspectives. And so maybe that's too complicated. Let's stay away from urban renewal. Let's go to the joints, the hangouts, the Cozy Corner, the 99, Shine Boys, the Grill, the Playhouse Inn, Peachtree, Sky Blue, Blue Moon, Tiptoe Inn, White City Pool Room, Stag Bar. Which one? Well, okay, let's stick with the ones that the whites were the clientele. Or maybe we should stick with the ones that the blacks were the clientele. Or maybe focus on those that were white-owned but black-operated. Well, we'll look at one little story here, the Blue Moon. And I said to the fellow, "Describe the Blue Moon to me." And he said, "Oh, it's just a beer joint, just a hangout." Now, that old rascal, 20 grand, he'd get a couple cases of beer bottles and fill them up with water, had these girls in there, and they'd cap it off and go out and ask a guy, "Buy me a beer. Get me a beer." You go get them a beer, and it's a damn bottle of water, charging a quarter, too. Well, forget the joints. Forget the joints. There's too many of them. Let's just stick with the bad men, or the strong men, or the ward healers, or the kingpins. John Wallace. We could do a week's worth of programs on John Wallace, a program every night this week. You'd never cover the same material twice. He was a Don Juan, a Robin Hood, a bootlegger, a grocer, and according to one man who was his nephew by marriage, an evil bastard. So let me quote a couple perspectives on John Wallace. I met Mr. Wallace when I was 12, and he was a soldier in the Salvation Army. He met my brother and sister and me, and we all played together. We worked up at the hemp mill. Later on in years, we got to going together, and he was 18 and I was 15, and we married when I was only 16 years old and moved to Louisville, and he worked at the veneering mill. We later moved back to Frankfort, where our parents lived, and he began to go to church. He lived a good life for many, many years, but finally drifted back to that old crowd. And he always had a desire to live for the Lord. He's a good-hearted man. And when we got up on our feet, why, he'd give until it hurt. Had a terrible temper, though. And he did things that he'd regret to his dying day. And I know he's missed by the thousands he befriended. That's his wife. Now, we don't want to hear from his nephew by marriage. I had an uncle, John Wallace, and he's a bad man, an evil man. And I said to him, well, what do you mean? How was he evil? He'd beat the piss out of you for nothing. Beat up many a man. He hit my grandmother with a pair of brass knucks. He's mean, evil. Oh, he shot 1 or 2, 3 different ones. And I started trying to get a little more balance on this. And I said, well, it's funny on him. Some people will tell you that he's a nice man, that he'd give you credit at his store. He'd give you a load of coal, or he'd let you run up a tab. And the guy came back and he said, now this is my opinion of John Wallace. He said, in my opinion, he's my uncle by marriage, and he was a no-good bastard. And that's, you can just get, if you can't even get 2 people to agree on almost any aspect of the bottom. Which story? It's your expectations that concern me. I don't want to disappoint people. I make a real hard effort not to disappoint people. And I'm sure some of you came here to hear about mixing it up, or drinking it up, or dancing it up, or any of those other ups that were available for a price. But that is not my focus tonight. It's part of the story. It's not the whole story, and it, from my perspective, is a rather small part of the story, and one that I would need a much better understanding of before I would focus on it. Vice did exist. There's no question about it. You could go to Ida's, Maggie's, Doughbelly's. You could get home brew. Bootleg whiskey was available. Cards or dice. But my point is, those kind of activities did not define the lives of the residents. And they could be found in other sections of Frankfort as well. Listen to what the residents have to say about vice. It's like I said, even the illegitimate businesses, we didn't own them. I mean, we might be running it, but it was for somebody living up on Capitol Avenue, you know. This is one about prostitutes. There were 2 outstanding prostitutes down there. They was called, I can't think of their names right now, but they was nice to colored people. They were, and they were white, and they'd just stop, and they'd always have something nice to say to you. And I said, so they were pretty much a part of the community? They were a part, because they knew, I'll tell you, I hate to say this, they brought their stuff down into the black area because they knew they couldn't live in the better area. But we didn't pay no attention, because as long as they took care of their business and didn't bother us and was nice to children and everything, well, then that was okay. Crime. We didn't know what it was to lock our door. You didn't know what it was to have a screen. You could go to bed. You could go anywhere. Go out on the town. Those who was able to go out on the town, you'd come back, your house would be just like you left it. Didn't have no robbers or anything like that. Everybody looked out for one another. Bootleg. Bootleg liquor. Frankfort people had it. Frankfort people had it because I've been around it. Well, and I said to her, you had to make some money, didn't you? And she said, you had to. If you wanted to live, because people had families, and men, they was trying to live on $7 a week and trying to have a family, and even though living was cheap, you wanted to look right. You wanted to dress your kids right. You wanted to set a good table like everybody else. Put a chicken on the table. I know what I'm talking about. Some of them bootleggers had lovely homes, and their customers was the rich white people. And I said to her, somebody told me that a lot of times liquor would come in and a white person would bring it in. And she said they'd more or less hire a black person to sell it for them. That's right, that's so. Now look what I'm talking about, because I had friends that did it. I had a girlfriend and I would help her, and we were protected. We knew the man uptown was with us. So you can see just from those few comments that even if you focused on vice, even if you looked at it, you'd have to look at it from many different perspectives. And so we're going to steer clear of that tonight, because tonight's story is more about how the residents felt, their attitudes, their accomplishments, their leaders, their institutions. And I would say this to you, this is a preview. It is not a final product. It is very much a work in progress. On the table here is a little sign-up sheet. If anybody has a remembrance or they have a photo that they'd allow me to copy, I'd very much appreciate it, because in my mind, someday we're going to have an exhibit on this subject. Someday you're going to walk into a room about this size, and we're going to have just a beautiful, beautiful exhibit on the bottom. So if you do have something that you'd be willing to share, your time, a memory, a photo, please put your name on the tablet there and we'll get with you. If you want this program after we hear it, well then we'll sign up for that too. This study began in 1991 and it was really work for a master's degree in history. The focus was urban renewal. And I looked on to somebody who was very helpful to me, Mike Fields, over at the HUD office. And Mike allowed me to use some records that he had available to him. And it was excellent. It really got me started right. But once I got into urban renewal, it just sort of leads you into the community. And I started looking at the books that had been published, and there was a lot of secondary sources that were written by non-residents. I remember a book called Filling in the Chinks, Romana Jett Darnell. And she would write about Craw, and she said, people speak of this place as if it were a thing. They say, the Craw. It is a place, not a thing. Never say the Craw. And so anytime in her book she has the letters, when she's referencing the Craw, she has NTC, never the Craw. Well, look on this map over here, this property map from the mid-1950s. It's an urban renewal map, and it indicates who owns property down in the bottom. And look at the names. So I went to the residents to get their perspective because I thought the secondary sources were written mostly by non-residents. And to date, I've conducted 24 interviews, and I've met some of the finest people that you would ever want to meet. I've been in homes that had exquisite antiques. We've talked, we've laughed. I've literally sat at the feet of people and spent 2 to 3 hours just sharing with them. And many, many times, most of the time, I came away with much more than I ever brought into the situation. What would they want to tell you about their neighborhood? Listen, I suppose I've always been overly sensitive when people talked about that part of town. Always felt like their thought was, if you come from that part of town, you couldn't possibly amount to anything. Well, thank God. I know different. It was no surprise to me when people that didn't live in that area came up with the nickname Craw. I think we were thought of as subhuman. Well, we had hopes and dreams, goals, just like the people who lived in other parts of Frankfort. Saturday night in the bottom. Everybody in this town at one time or another visited the bottom. Remember that. Remember it. The high, the low, and the in-between. The rich, the white, the black. At some time or another, they all visited the bottom. If you wanted to have a good time, you went to the bottom. And I asked this woman, what are the elements of a good time? I mean, what was a good time? Well, at that time, for the blacks, it was going to the American Legion. It was the place to go, to be dressed up, to be seen, to meet people. That was every Saturday night. That was your big night out. You worked from sunup to sundown, 5 days a week and a half a day on Saturday. But Saturday night, you went out. That's what I'm trying to tell you. People would sit in their nice neighborhoods and talk about the bottom, but on Saturday night, they would be down there. When you remember bottom, talking to a woman, what comes to mind? Well, there's so many things. The first thing that comes to my mind is the neighborliness, the closeness. And this seems a little strange, but we were black and white together. Next door to me was a white couple, and in the same house with them lived a black couple. It was, apartments. The things that you read now about finding people that have been dead for 3 or 4, 5, 6 days, that didn't happen. If you lived next door to me and I didn't see you come out, put something on your clothesline, well, the first thing I did was, I wonder what's wrong with them today. I haven't seen them today. I'd ask my neighbor, have you seen so-and-so? And they'd say, no, I haven't. Well, they might be sick. We checked on them, and we shared. If I had food and my next-door neighbor didn't, I shared what I had because we were all poor together. Everyone knew one another, and we was just close. We'd stand, and then it's like this hot weather. We didn't have no electric. People would stand out on their porch till it would cool off, and they would talk to each other until 11, and it would be fun to hear them talk. Well, my mother's name was Mary Emily. Mary Emily, it's time to go in. Think we can go to bed now. you had to have fans, or if you didn't, you made them with a newspaper. And that's the way people enjoyed themselves in the bottom. Sit out on the stoop, share. At the corners, the women would come together as soon as they got off work, and they would meet one another and share the news. And it would be fun. It was a good place. Everybody. You could see everybody. You go down and sit on the corner, and people come into town to see somebody, and they'd say, well, have you seen so-and-so? And all you had to do was say to them, go down, sit at the corner of Clinton and Washington. They'll be by, and they would be. Everybody would come together. It was a friendly attitude, blacks and whites living together. They'd have their scrapes, their fights. Sometimes there'd be a shooting. But they were in the neighborhood, and everybody looked out for each other. So you can see right there, just from those few quotes, that this is a place that many people, and this is 30 years after this place is gone. It's been gone since the mid-60s, really. 30 years. Those kind of memories still coming back to people. So our goals tonight is to examine the institutions, the leaders, to find out some very simple things. Why was the name Bottom used, or Craw? Where was it located? What was the history of it? Who were the residents? What made them unique? To see if the stereotypes that we have heard about, poverty, violence, labels like slum, to see if those are really accurate, and to balance what we think we know with the residents' perspective. And the major points I'll make tonight, and if you don't take anything else away, try to carry these with you. External forces, the river, prohibition, logging, absentee landlords, urban renewal. External forces created, perpetuated, and ultimately destroyed the bottom. Residents did not create the conditions in the bottom. They endured them. Some triumphed over them. Others were destroyed by them. And maybe the most important of all, to say Craw is not the same as to say bottom. And this is my perspective only, and you might disagree with it. That's perfectly all right. Those two words are not interchangeable terms. Craw is a vice district. Bottom is a neighborhood. Craw is exploitive, extractive. It takes from people and takes it out of the community. Bottom is caring and sharing. It's togetherness and love. Craw is utilized not only by residents, by many, many outsiders coming in. Bottom is for the local folk. Bottom is a network of friends, family. Geographically, they're intertwined, but bottom, from my perspective, is higher ground than Craw, not burdened with the labels that Craw carries, and reserves and deserves a special identity. During the slideshow, I'll quote from some of the interviews. As I said, I will not discuss who the people are. If profanity is used, I will quote it. I will not quote racial epitaphs, and I want to say to you that the people I met with were outstanding people, fine people. Heard very little in the way of profanity and almost no racial epitaphs. Afterwards, we'll have a little question and answer, and these maps up here are Sanborn insurance maps, and I've Xeroxed the originals and done paste-ups. The year on the map says 1925, but actually, when the Sanborn Company would do their paste-ups, they brought it forward to 1940. So the buildings, the structures indicated are actually as current as 1940. The color code is derived from city directories. I would go to city directories and I'd go street by street looking for names, resident patterns, and I'd color code. The pink lines are for African Americans. In the 1940 map, this one here, the solid color pink indicates it's an African American homeowner who resides in their home. And then the map here is the urban renewal property map. And all you have to do is identify the block, look up the block number and the parcel number, and then you can find out who owned it. And these are really fun. The two other items up there, the best newspaper article I've ever seen written was done by Ron Herron, and it's an interview with Papa Jazz Berry, and I've attached it there to the board, and then there's a picture of Mayo Underwood School. So let's go down in the bottom for a while. Can we kill some more of those lights, John? Let's just knock them all out. Except maybe the ones back. You could maybe keep those on over the portrait. I think those are, yeah, that'd be nice. Where was it? Where was it? It's very hard to get any two people to agree where it was. But the boundaries that I use are the ones for the Urban Renewal Project. I'm going to jump around in front of you here. This is not the best of photographs. It's an aerial view from about 1956, and it's from an appraiser's document during the Urban Renewal Project. My boundaries for the bottom may be very different from yours. But what I do is I start on the west with the river. The south is Broadway and the railroad tracks. I go far north as Hill Street. Others will go all the way out to Mid Factory Hill, which I think, on reflection, I should have done. It was a mistake not to go all the way out to Mid Factory Hill. And I go as far east, let's see here, as St. Clair, on the little capital here. It's over here. As far east as St. Clair. And then a little bit of blank ran over. You can see the appraiser has marked out the urban renewal area in red. But that's my boundaries for bottom, and I'd be happy to talk to anybody who has different boundaries. Whereas Craw is more or less right at the intersection of Washington and Clinton, and there's some joints here, and maybe a few scattered in other places, but right here is about Craw. The name, bottom, or Craw. Well, there's a couple different stories on the name. The one that's most accepted is the river. The river comes up, the crawfish are stranded, thus the Craw. But I ran into several other stories, and I'd like to just share them with you real quickly. It's like I said to you, there was a man down there, just like John Buckner. He owned a lot of property, and you'd go to that man, and they'd tell you to go to him, and they'd say, go to Craw. He'll find you a house. And that's what they'd say. And that's where it came from. And then when them crawfish would come up, that's where he got it. And I thought to myself, no, this doesn't sound, anything I've heard of. And then if I didn't read in an article in 1918 in the State Journal that says, Craw took its name from the low terrain, which is in keeping with the moral level of the section. A well-known character of pugilistic proclivities when in liquor, loudly proclaimed himself to be the best man from Crawfish Bottom, and gradually his nickname was trimmed down to Craw, and that name clung to the district. So it's amazing to me, you'll hear something in an oral testimony which is very hard to verify, and here we have another viewpoint on the name Craw. The section was platted very early on. This is Achilles Sneed map, and it dates to 1803, but the area was really not heavily settled till after the Civil War. Okay, here's a Maypother, Hart Maypother map, and let's look at a close-up of it so you can get a little bit better detail. The green section there in the center is the old Capitol and the buildings on the old Capitol grounds, and then you can see toward the upper left corner, very little in the way of dwellings. Look along Wilkinson Street, which is on your far left running straight up. Very little at all prior to the Civil War. Now when you go, let's look at an 1871 bird's eye view. This is an artist's rendition of Frankfort. And we look at a close-up of the 1871. And still, there's more houses now along Wilkinson Street. There's more houses north of Miro, which is in the lower left corner there. But still, it's not as heavily settled as you would think. Then you go to the 1882 Atlas, and if you notice, the bottom is mostly in the 3rd Ward there. And there, you can see what's starting to happen. North of Miro, the houses are coming in. There's the Corinthian Baptist Church, that little green block. It's about the center of the screen there. And you can see the gas factory. If you look straight at the center, that's the circle that's in the center there. And that was one of the earlier structures in that particular area. But what's happening here is that Frankfort is industrializing. It's growing. African Americans are coming into the community. Between the years 1860 and 1870, the city's black population increased 82%. And then again, in the next decade, 37%. And the white population grew 20% to 3,700 people. So you can see the continued growth in the area. And much of this, again, is driven by industrialization. Blacks and whites are coming to Frankfort. They're seeking employment. They're seeking educational opportunities. The logging industry is picking up. You could go down on the banks of the Kentucky River in Frankfort, and I can't quote you all the names of the sawmills: Congleton, T.E. Kinney, Banning, many, many others. And so this is the reason that the area is growing. It's low-lying. It's about 50 acres, but the housing is cheap, and people need to be close to the heart of town. So that's what the advantage that Craw had. Some of the early institutions that grew up as this section started to be settled, and there's a number of them. Look on the map here. You'll see in the very center the green wedge. That's the Kentucky State Penitentiary. Well, to the right of that is another green wedge, and you can't really make out the lettering from here, but it is the Clinton Street School for Colored Students. And it's in an effort to obtain a better school for the colored students, began in 1877 and culminated with the city passing an ordinance that would allow the tax revenues to be used for building this school. Here's a picture of the school. I haven't found a photograph of it, but I did find a line drawing of it. And this was out of a newspaper. It was a 3-story brick, and it was wedged in between the prison, a junkyard, and the hill right on Clinton, East Clinton Street. Here's the first principal, William H. Mayo. He was the principal. He came in 1882. He accepted the job. He was only 19 years old. He'd just gotten his degree from Cincinnati High School. And he taught and led Clinton Street for 40 years, retiring in the early 1920s. And here's a picture with some of the students at the base of the Clinton Street School. We have in our collection in the library annual reports from the Clinton Street School. And they are the most fascinating documents that you would ever want to look at, because they tell you quite a bit about the economic, the social, the health conditions within the city. And some of the reports, Mayo writes, attendance varied with the seasons. The epidemic which existed in our city during the past winter, and he's talking about the 1888-89 winter, has been very severe, and the weather has affected our attendance. Many of the boys and girls are kept from school by their parents on the account of the need to assist in rendering a livelihood. And I found in looking at those records, once you hit about the 6th grade, even though the school ran up through the 12th grade, many of the students dropped out. Very few would continue all the way on through, and I guess in many instances went home to help Mama and Daddy make a living. And looking at the 1914-1915 school year, of the 347 pupils, only a third of them were in grades beyond the 6th grade. In that particular year, 1914-15, there were 13 teachers, 8 of which lived in the bottom. This is Professor Mayo's daughter, Selena, and that is the most beautiful dress I have ever seen on a woman. She went on to graduate from Clinton and went back to teach at the school. And she was the directress of the school's domestic science and art department. And she later would teach at Mayo Underwood. This is their home on 311 Wilkeson Street. When you talk about, some people will say, well, only poor people lived in the bottom. Well, they didn't live in the bottom, but you can see that these are not poor people. They are upper middle class. Educators, teachers were very much looked up to by the community. They were idolized by their students and the adult community. The Wilkeson Street School, I don't have an image of it with me, but I've been told, and maybe somebody can correct me, I've been told that it was further down on Wilkeson, and you see that blue building right there about the upper center? That, I believe, is the Wilkeson Street School before it was relocated farther out Wilkeson Street. But the white families equally valued education, and they resented it very much when South Frankfort would get more facilities or more school dollars than their facilities would receive. And I've seen several newspaper articles where they complained bitterly that the South Frankfort people were getting more attention from the school system than they were getting. When you talk about institutions that buoyed up the community, that supported residents, one of the first that comes to mind is the Oddfellows building. This image is made in 1917. The building itself was built in 1908 and located at 429 Washington Street. It was built by black craftsmen, funded by blacks, and served as the headquarters of the Capital City Lodge and the Household of Ruth and the Frankfort Black Masonic Order. I think it's a very impressive structure, and it's very reflective of the pride and the resourcefulness of the community. It functioned as a social center, as a business center, and a meeting place and a rallying point. And this is one of the lodges here, and I'm not really sure which of the lodges this is. Again, the image dates back to 1917. Lodges and secret societies, mutual benefit societies, served as a safety net. They helped widows and orphans. They raised funds for local projects, provided insurance benefits. They instilled values of thrift and industry and hard work. And they were places to socialize and have recreation. It was evidence of the philosophy of self-help and race solidarity. This is one of the lodges. I've been told it's the United Brothers of Friendship, organized in 1897. All in 1912, in little bitty Frankfort, we had 23 chapters representing 10 different organizations. And this is just in the black community alone. I'm sure there was even more in the white community. We had Oddfellows, we had the Knights of Pythias, the Masonic Lodge, the Mosaic Templars of America, the Order of the Eastern Star, the Good Samaritans, Sisters of the Mysterious Ten, the Union Benevolent Society, the United Brothers of Friendship, the GAR had their George W. Monroe post, all of which, or for the most part, met in that building that we saw just a few minutes ago. And I was at a home of an individual, and he brought out to me something that I never thought I would see, lodge ribbons. Beautiful, beautiful lodge ribbons that dated back to 1897. And they had almost like ceramic tops on them, and they were just gorgeous. And if you have any kind of artifacts that relate to our community's history, please hold on to them. These things are very precious. He had stumbled onto these things just in an abandoned church. It wasn't even in our community. They were scattered on the floor. So there are things that relate to our history out there. And the lodges were a way for a young man or a young woman to move up in the world, really, a network. Here's Professor Mayo. He is a Mason. He's got his robe on there, his uniform, carrying his sword. It provided people with leadership opportunities, and I think that's one of the reasons there were so many of these lodges. Again, I said the Oddfellows building was a center of business. Here's the People's Pharmacy, and the photo dates back to 1912. Again, we're at 429 Washington Street. Just to tell you some of the businesses that were in there in 1912, they had a restaurant, they had the Capitol Amusement Company. Then in 1930, the La Palma restaurant was located in the same space that you see. Dr. E.E. Underwood had his offices. Dr. W.G. Weathers, the Mammoth Life Insurance Company, which was a black insurance company that was organized in Louisville, but they had a regional office here in Frankfort in that particular building. In 1940, this space was occupied by the Lum and Abner store. Lum and Abner were much like Amos and Andy. And the Lum and Abner store was run by John J. Sullivan, who was in there at that time. And then 10 years later, Fred Allen had his barbershop, and eventually the American Legion and the VFW all used that building. There were many, many black businesses. And I just wanted to show you a few images. This is not in the bottom. It's on Broadway. This is Benjamin F. Spencer's boot shop. He had been born a slave, a man who educated himself, eventually acquired a teaching certificate, taught for 6 years, and then opened his boot shop in Frankfort. These images are at the University of Kentucky. But it's just another example of the business climate that was down close to the area or in the area. There were many, many black entrepreneurs. Here's another one of them, the Thomas K. Robb Funeral Home. The Robb Funeral Home was located at the corner of St. Clair and Clinton, right in the northwest corner there. But in addition to these kind of businesses, there was contractors, plasters, brick masons. I was surprised how many black craftsmen were operating in the area at the turn of the century. We had craftswomen as well. There were seamstresses, hairdressers. They had professionals, teachers, doctors, lawyers, pharmacists. So when people say to you that the bottom was nothing but poor people, that is not correct. There was never less than 2 or 3 physicians in the area. This slide here is representative of one of the businesses that you'd see a lot of, grocery stores and restaurants. This is William Hayden's restaurant. The date of this particular image is 1919. And what you're looking at is the intersection of Washington and Clinton. Put your back to the Oddfellows building and look cat-a-corner to the northwest corner, and this is what you'd see. William Hayden's, I think he would like to refer to it as a restaurant. It could have been more than that. But he was a policeman, and this particular address is 400 West Clinton. Later, Clemson Onan would have his grocery in here. It eventually became the Tiptoe Inn, and later the Cozy Corner. Let me just read you something about the Cozy Corner. The Cozy Corner, that was up in the bottom. It was just a place where young people and older people sat and went to drink, to eat, have a sandwich, buy a cold beer. It was just a place where you met friends. It was a clean place, a nice place. I show you this image, and this is in a private collection. We're going to concentrate on the photo that's up in the upper left corner. That's at the intersection of Clinton and Wilkeson Street. And it, at one time, housed a grocery. Alonzo Lewis's grocery was in there at one time. But almost on every street corner, it's amazing to me how many groceries were down, small little operations, but the groceries that were down in this community. Let's just call off a few of them. Frog Woods, Triplets, Nell Sullivan's, Billy Dean's, Johnny Follis's, Bryant's Grocery, Marshall's, Joe Burkhart's. Benjamin Clark had a grocery in this particular building, the one in the upper left corner, in 1912. In 1940, Alonzo Lewis was running the B&B grocery in there. And eventually a used furniture store went in there. And to tell you about groceries, I talked to one of the restaurants and residents, and he said they just carried enough stuff for the neighborhood. Like they had some of everything. Not a lot of everything, but some. A bag of taters. Stand it up there in the store, and you'd go get 10 pounds. I'd get 10 pounds. By Monday night, that might be gone. And then they buy a little bit more. It was credit. Credit held up those institutions. You had to have credit. Besides the businesses we talked about, there was a thriving professional community. And I don't think that you could talk about the bottom and not talk about this particular man, Dr. E.E. Underwood. He came here to Frankfort, and I'm not sure of the exact date. I've seen references to him in the 1890s. He may have been here earlier than that. He was a leader in the black community, a physician. He was also an author, and he's probably written the best book on the colored churches of Frankfort. It's entitled The Colored Churches of Frankfort. Came out in 1906. Beautiful, beautiful photographs in that book, many of which are in the collection of the Kentucky Historical Society. He was a poet, a newspaper publisher. He published a newspaper called the Bluegrass Bugle. It was in publication from 1899 to 1918. Professor Mayo was on the editorial board, Tom Brooks, who was a contractor, and then Dr. Underwood edited it. But he was also a leader in the NAACP. He died in 1944 and was eventually, his shoes were filled by Dr. B.T. Holmes, who came into the community in the late 40s to fill that void when Dr. Underwood had passed away. He lived only 2 doors down from Tony Papa on Mirror Street, about 310 Mirror. And he was at the center of the political world for the blacks. He was a big-time Republican. Here he is with the Exposition Committee in 1915, and I don't know exactly what the Exposition Commission, I believe it was called, Exposition Commission, was doing, but you can see that he was at the center of it. Other black leaders, John Buckner. John Buckner. He owned considerable property in the bottom. He had nine parcels in the bottom alone, plus others in South Frankfort. He was a domestic. He worked for the Berries along with his wife up at Berry Hill. And status could come to a black by association with an important or powerful white family. But John was also a far-sighted individual, a talented individual, a carpenter. Let me tell you a real quick John Buckner story. I talked to a fellow about living in the bottom. He said, I rented a house from an old colored fellow. And I went to pay my rent one day, and he said, Joe, how much you paying me? And I said, well, that's $100, John. I said, I've been here 10 months. And he said, well, what if I was to tell you to move? What would you have? And I said, well, I don't think you'll tell me to move as long as I pay my rent. And he said, Joe, you ain't listening. You ain't getting what I'm getting at. I want you to own you a home. And I said, well, man, ain't no way I can get it. He said, Joe, I'm going to fix it so you can have you a home. Now, this is a black fella. And I said, what was his name? John Buckner. Well, he worked for the Berries for years and years and owned a bunch of houses and went up. He took me up to the old Capitol building and loan and said, you all got a house for sale on Wilkinson, and I want this boy to own it. Said he lives in my house and always paid his rent, but I want him to own him a house. Now here's a leader in the black community. I think it's a beautiful, beautiful example of some of the positive race relationships that were down in the bottom. Here's a black man who's well off helping a white man acquire a home. The man there, the second from the left, is John Ecton, a contractor who helped build the Oddfellows building. The main point that I'm trying to make to you all is it's not just poor people. There was a class structure in the bottom, but the criteria for being middle class or upper class is not necessarily the thickness of your wallet or where you live, because oftentimes you don't have much choice where you live. Status might come from education, it might come from the complexion, it might come from your occupation or your association with a powerful family. Here's the Robb family. Do you remember the funeral home I showed you? The little boy on the right, there's Jack Robb, and that's his two sisters there. There's Jack in his day dress there. This is at the turn of the century. They were the children of T.K. and Mrs. Robb. They lived next door to their funeral home on St. Clair Street. They were leaders in the community. Here's Jack at 1969. You can see how fair-complected he is. He formed the Grad Club, a support organization for Mayo Underwood. He helped with the arrangements for Martin Luther King's visit to Frankfort. He was a leader, an entertainer. He would perform piano, organ, at white and black places. He was well accepted by all parties. And during the urban renewal, Jack was hired as a relocation officer in 1965 to help the residents make that transition out of the bottom. One of the things that people told me, and I'm very naive about a lot of things. A lady, as an elderly black woman, she said, Jack never passed. Jack never passed. And I'm sitting there and I said, I don't know what this woman means. Now I'll try and bluff. Do not try to bluff an elderly black woman, because that is a mistake. What she means is Jack could have passed himself as white. He could have gone anywhere and said, I'm white. He didn't do that. And he gained a lot of respect, I think, because of that. He never denied his heritage. But there was many leaders. I wish I had a picture of Will Castleman. I don't. What a man. If you wanted the votes in the bottom, you went to Will Castleman. And someday, maybe in my Christmas stocking, I'll find a copy of a photo of Will Castleman, because he's a man we could do a program on just as well. Not everybody was a doctor, a lawyer, a contractor. Many of the African Americans were domestics. You can see, now this family, the photo is 1898. I do not know the name of the family, but you can see the man on the right. He might be a gardener, he might be a butler, or a chauffeur even. But many of the blacks, both men and women, served in the homes of whites as nurses, maids, housekeepers. In 1950, the weekly wage for a black woman as a domestic servant was $13, and 41% of all working black women were domestics. Between 1890 and 1910, 50 to 70% of all black women, all adult women, worked. They were gainfully employed. Here's a shot of a woman. The children are identified as the children of Ms. L.B. Conway. The nurse is not identified. There's a book out, and if you ever get a chance, it's a cheap one. It's Labor of Love, Labor of Sorrow by Jacqueline Jones. Look, the skills that brought respect to a woman in her community: cooking, caring for children, housekeeping, looking after your family. Those are the same skills that took them out of their homes, that took them in the homes of white people. And I can't help but think, what was on this woman's mind as she's holding some other woman's babies? I can't think, where are my children? Who's looking after my kids? When I get home at 9 tonight, I got all this work to do. So you can see that for generations, black women have been caught in the fix that many of our own white gals are caught in now, of conflicting priorities of work and home. Let me quote you just real quick. I asked a woman, what kind of work did your mama have? Well, mamas, you could either cook, or you could nanny, or you could do laundry work. And I said, well, how did you get one of those jobs? Well, really, you was recommended. If you were known to be a good cook, you'd soon find out, and people would find out, and they always entertained. They did a lot of entertaining back in those days, and families would, well, your name was brought in that way. Well, tell me about your mama. You told me a story about your mama bringing home food to you. We called it smother boxes. Well, what was a smother box? Well, it was leftovers. It was just anything that was left on the table that they didn't want, brought home from their kitchen, their table. They'd allow Mama to bring home a little bit for the children, just enough to feed the children. So she got that in addition to her wages, I asked. And I said, yeah. And she said, Mama got $5 a week. And that was good money for a lady. Laundresses. Many, many laundresses. I don't have an image of a laundress, but let me just tell you, most of the blacks and whites got along down there. They lived together, one next to the other. But I'll tell you, one of the more popular things I remember down there was the white people used to come down there and they'd bring their laundries on a Monday. And the black people knew what time to expect it. Well, approximately. They'd drive up and they'd honk their horns, and there's blacks to go out and get the laundry. And they knew exactly what time they were supposed to pick it up, and they'd come back by, and by the same token, they'd honk the horn and we'd bring out the laundry. And I said, well, you mean they didn't even get out of their cars? And I said, no, they's a half afraid. They'd heard so many rumors and stories about the bottom. They just wanted to get that laundry and get out of there as quick as they could. Everybody worked. Everybody worked. My brother used to deliver clothes for people because all those rich white people, they'd have us do their clothes. But the thing I remember most about is the stories about cooks. This is Ben Madison. The photo was right at the turn of the century. I don't know the exact year. He was a leader at the First Baptist Church. But it seems like almost every interview I had, there'd be stories about cooking or cooking skills or respect for a man or a woman who could cook. So let me just lay a few stories on you here. Mama Bryant. This is a fellow talking. Now, she was a prominent person. She lived at the corner of Clinton and Center Street. And I said to this fellow, I said, well, what made her prominent? Well, she had food sales. She was an outstanding cook. During that time, they called them food sales festivals. Saturday night, people had the food sales. They hung up a lantern on a nail, and you could look and see, and there was that festival over at Mama Bryant's, festival there at Miss Jackson's. Well, people could cook, and you'd go there, and they'd have maybe fried chicken or fish or something different that people wanted. And I'd, of course, I had my little wagon. I'd take orders, and maybe 8-10 people wanted it. And they'd put it in plates or bowls, and I'd take it back to them. Made myself a nickel here or there doing that. So you just went down, and you waited, and got your place, and sat down, wrap up that food, and took it out. And I said to this man, well, why do they call them festivals? I mean, why is it a festival? And he said, well, I guess it was just a gathering of the people. I've often wondered myself, just like you and I, we say, well, let's go down there tonight. Let's eat ourselves some fish. Well, here comes somebody else, and they're eating too, and we're all sitting at the table laughing and talking. I guess that's why it's a festival. Well, when you talk about status, you can talk about that for a long time, but what's on most people's minds is not status. It's survival. And one of the things that the bottom is noted for is flooding, high water. This is a photograph taken from the old Capitol. You're looking west toward the Kentucky River. It's the 1883 flood, I believe. And this photo is so typical. It's perfect. Perfect for the bottom. It's the corner or intersection of Clinton and Washington. You're looking north toward the hill, Washington Street. And repeatedly, over and over, people told me when the water came up, it always came up first at the intersection of Clinton and Washington. This is a 1937 flood map. I have no images of the 37 flood, but look at the shaded parts, the pinstripe parts. That's where the water got. You can see right in the dead center is that darker shaded blue. That was a dry area. You can see some other dry areas a little bit to the south and to the west there, but you can see the entire area was inundated. Let me quote you about the floods. I guess the worst tragedy I can remember down there is the 37 flood. Oh, it was terrible, terrible. The water come up and got all our homes. Yeah, my sister-in-law lived up on the hill there, and the water didn't get to her house. There was 18 of us up there in 3 little rooms where the people had been flooded out, and the electric was off. There was only one little 2-cap stove in there. We called it a 2-cap monkey, and that's what we cooked on. That water went down, and we went back in there, and we built a fire. Well, we really moved in before it dried out in there, and they told us, they said, watch it, it's going to kill you. You'll take a double pneumonia. And we didn't have no other place to go. This is the 1962 flood, and you're looking west on Clinton Street at the intersection of Washington and Clinton, and you recognize the Oddfellows building there. What struck me when I was hearing these flood stories was that people's ability to persevere, people's ability to overcome. Let me just quote you again. I'm going to say something else here. I found that in the bottom, when the water came up and everybody had to move out, they'd move them out, and then it was almost like a convention or something like that. They'd move them out, and that water went, and we'd have drinks and play cards and everything. It was a celebration in a way. And by the same token, when the water went down, we'd go back in, start cleaning our houses out, having the same type of party. And do you know, I have always said that people that didn't know the people in the bottom didn't realize who they were, because those people down there were the cleanest people I ever met. I've got a number of slides here of the housing conditions. They're all taken in 1913 and 1914. They were made by a group called the Civic League, which was a progressive-era women's organization. The earliest reference I've found to it is 1903. It may have existed before then, but its mission was to promote cleanliness. Now let's say one thing. People will tell you photos don't lie. That is not correct. Any piece of evidence can be manipulated to say what you want it to say. Now, a group that's out to promote cleanliness, what kind of photos are they going to take? Are they going to take photos of areas that are already clean? No. So bear that in mind as we look at these images. And bear in mind the title of this series of images, which is on the back, The Slums of Frankfort. Here are some houses on Wilkinson Street. You're looking west. There's the river in the background. If you look at the urban renewal statistics, you might be tempted to conclude that this area was a slum. There were small lots. There were limited yards. Most of the homes were heated with grate or coal stoves. There was no furnaces. Few had indoor plumbing. 266 out of the 460 dwellings had no indoor bathing facilities. 40% had only cold water coming into their houses. Urban renewal officials in the 1950s deemed 89% of the 358 buildings in the bottom deficient. I tell you what, you want to make some of these people mad. You go down there and you sit down and you call their neighborhood a slum. And I'll tell you, you will get some people hot at you, because I did it by mistake. and survived it, I might add. But I was educated by it, I will tell you that. I said to a woman, some people call that area a slum. Now, is that a fair label? No, sir. No, sir. I don't think it's a fair label to say it was a slum because people did the best they could. People didn't make no money, especially black people, and that little money that what they had, you had them landlords. You had them landlords. They came down for their money on Sunday morning before you went to church, and you better have it or else. And those people lived elsewhere. They wouldn't fix up nothing. Of course, some of the houses, they weren't kept up, like I said, but you couldn't afford it. You might paint the front of your house 10 years straight, but the back was falling down. Now, I was talking to a woman, and she said to me, she said, it wasn't no slum. A slum is a place, a creation of a person that don't have no care for themselves or for their place. Everybody was clean. The homes were clean. I've seen people go out and scrub and wash their sidewalks off. People was clean. You didn't see trash and stuff like that out in the yards. Everybody had pride. We had pride. The thing I want to say about this, I'm talking to another person. Now some of them homes, they wasn't big, beautiful homes or anything, but some was nice. And people took pride in their homes. It was theirs, and they could live in it, and their children could live in it. Then there was older people, and they thought they'd made it, so to speak. They had homes paid for. And it's just like any old neighborhood that you go anywhere. You'll see some good and some bad. And I want to tell you, 9 times out of 10, them houses that were bad, them people didn't own them. They rented from slumlords, and when I say slumlords, I mean slumlords. They didn't have to live in it. They didn't care what it looked like, and all they wanted was their $3 that every week. And if you didn't have it, you was on the street. And I know for sure, I lived on Washington Street, and in the winter, you could look at any wall, and you'd see daylight. Is this a slum? This is 1962 in the flood. You're looking across from Mayo Underwood School on Miro. You're looking south. And these homes here, Charles Field's house, James Scott, Ernest Woolridge. But you don't see many pictures of houses like this because many of the residents lost most of their photographs in floods or moves. But this is not a slum. This is Washington Street, 611 Washington Street. The man on your right is James Graham. The fellow next to him is Marshall Andrews. So you're looking west onto Washington Street there. Life was hard, but there were institutions that existed to help and to soften the conditions. The Salvation Army. This is a picture taken in 1915. The Salvation Army was organized in Frankfort in 1897. It was originally located on Clinton Street, 422 Clinton. Eventually, Johnny Fensel had his meat market in there, but originally the Salvation Army was there. And they moved to this building in 1915, which became their new headquarters. Look at the building on the far right. It's a brick building. It still stands today. If you go down there to the Salvation Army, I believe they have their thrift store there. It's one of the few buildings that's still down there. There were other institutions. The mission of the First Baptist Church, the Philadelphia Baraka Mission. This is an image taken in 1819. The Wilkinson Street School. Sunday School is the title of it. What year? 1919. Did I say 1819? My apologies, 1919. And then the YMCA. I talked to a fellow, he said, one day a week, they'd let us poor kids come in there and swim. And said, none of us owned swimsuits. We just swam in there naked and everything. And so I looked at this image, and all them kids have towels wrapped around them. Now I wonder, maybe they just all want to have towels wrapped around them. But I suspect that there is a reason. But I had a woman, I sat down with her, she's very elderly, and she gave me a letter that she had written that sort of pulls all these 3 institutions together. She said, we went to the Baptist Mission Church every Sunday to get a free card that let us go over to the picture show at the YMCA. Without that card, we didn't get in. We all sat on the floor, and it was funny pictures. No sound, but they's funny. Then on Sunday afternoon, we all went up to the Salvation Army later in the afternoon. And we all walked down to the bottom, or Craw as it was called, and there's a man. Called him Old Dad. He packed a drum, and others had horns and tambourines, and they'd all sing, and we'd sing with them. Stand there on the corner and listen to the service. And there were individuals who made an effort to soften the conditions of the bottom. This woman, as a matter of fact, you can look out the window over here in the daylight, and you'll see Averill's Pharmacy, the mortar and the pestle. This is Rebecca Averill. Miss Averill established a mission to help meet the needs of the neighborhood children. And I'm going to quote just briefly from a newspaper article. Miss Ann Hamilton and Miss Rebecca Averill established a mission in an empty storeroom at the corner of Miro and Wilkeson. And they offered free kindergarten. They clothed, bathed many a needy child. They organized games and singing. They visited children's homes and tried to shut down saloons. Some of the children were so dirty that these two ladies determined to clean them up. And they begged outgrown children's clothing from friends and installed a big tin wash tub. And into this they put the dirtiest little children, washing them from head to foot, especially the head, because oftentimes it was caked with dirt and full of vermin. And they put them into clean clothes, and the dirty clothes went into the stove or into the sack to be taken home. Many people trying to help folk in the bottom. But the institutions that were most active were the schools. And I really hate to show you this slide. This is the Mayo Underwood School, and it's in its declining years. If you go up to the map after this presentation, there's a picture of Mayo Underwood when it first opened, and it was a beautiful, beautiful facility. It was opened and dedicated in September of 1929. Mayo Underwood comes from Professor Mayo and Dr. E.E. Underwood. That's who they're named after. And right now you're looking at the gymnasium where those arched windows are. This is the part that fronts onto Miro Street. And the wing that goes back has all the classrooms, and it fronts onto Center Street. This is the class of 1931, the 8th grade class. It's Miss Blanton on the back side there. You know, Blanton Street was named for Professor Blanton. And this is his wife, the wife of the principal. Here's the graduating class of 1931 with Professor Blanton in the middle. The 8th grade class of 1940. There's Miss Laura Chase on the left with her students. The graduating class of 1947. And finally, the faculty. I'm just going to read you these names because there will be many people who watch the tape that will remember them. Let's look at the front row, and we'll start on the left. That's Marie Robinson. Next to her is Apperline Hayes, and there's Professor Blanton, the principal. There's Alice Samuels, who would later go on to be a principal herself. And the woman on the right is a woman you should remember, Mary Emma Tracy Ellis, Mother Ellis. She still lives. She's 90 years old, and she is the closest thing to a living legend in the black community that you can come across. One of the most articulate women I've ever met. The second row, Ira Case, Emma Blanton, Mary Holmes, Etta Banks Blanton, Marietta Paley, Marie Ellis Johnson, and finally, the woman on the right, the most light-complected, Selena Mayo. If you remember Selena in her beautiful dress. And on the last row, Clarence Johnson, James B. Brown, and Murray Condon. I know I'm reading a lot of quotes, but the way that people felt about their teachers amazes me. If our children felt about their teachers today the way some of the residents of the bottom felt about their teachers, we would be in good shape. I went to Mayo Underwood. The children in the city went from the 1st to the 12th grade, and the children in the country went to Rosenwall until they got to the 8th grade, and then they went to Mayo Underwood to go to high school. It was a brick building, large brick building, had our own auditorium, had offices and a library. Must have been a couple hundred students. The people I've talked to, and this is me saying to her, some of them have many happy memories of Mayo Underwood. Do you have happy memories? And she said, very happy. One of the finest memories of people I have of my teacher is Miss Cheney. And she's living now. She taught at Kentucky State later, and Dr. Cheney's wife. She taught, now this is the kind of woman, kind of teacher she was. We would go to her house after school, and she would teach us different things, how to dress, how to act, the niceties that some of us didn't always get at home. And her door was always open to us. And right now she calls me one of her children, and I almost worship her. She's lovely. But then we had so many that stand out in your mind. I wanted to take typing once, but I waited so late. Miss Apperline Hayes was our typing teacher, and she fixed it so I could take it. She would bring a portable typewriter to school every day to teach me typing. And she lived in South Frankfort, and she walked. She carried that typewriter with me every day just so I could learn how to type. We had teachers, real teachers. They were dedicated. We had a recreational center. You could play. Jap Grob would have programs. We loved plays back then, and you could go in the evening. There'd be dancing and singing and fun. When we go to school mostly every night, Miss Holmes would be with us, and she'd chaperone, and we'd play. It was a social center. Now this, I know it's not something that really looks very interesting on the surface of it, but I think it's one of the most compelling and revealing images in the whole slideshow. This is a group of students lined up outside the Tiger Inn. You're going to go get some lunch. Now, Mayo Underwood did not have a cafeteria, so you had to go out, either go home or go to the Tiger Inn. And the Tiger Inn was about a block up from Mayo Underwood, headed east on Miro. I guess what you'd call it is the equivalent of Pete's Corner, but for the black children in the community. It was organized in 1831 by Ewing Atkins, Murray Conda, and Tubba Marshall. And it really was the hangout for youngsters. Well, the Tiger Inn, now, we went to the Tiger Inn every day for lunch. And we, once we got in high school and had a little money, we'd go get Mr. Atkins' chili or his beans. It was a place to go, It was a hangout, mostly for the young kids. Come at lunchtime. You'd have a soda. I mean, after school, your parents would let you go there at night because there wasn't nothing going on there. And I said, well, what attracted you to the Tiger Inn? I guess they gave us a little freedom. We could go in there and we could play the record player. And then we could stand up and they had a fountain and you could buy a Coke or sit down and talk to one another or talk to Mr. Atkins and he'd listen to you. I said it was a social center, and it very much was. This is a slide. Out in our community are artifacts that relate to these things. And this is a particular poster. It's for a benefit, one of those programs that I was talking to you about. It's called the Jazz Wedding and Fashion Review. Friday, September 19th, 1930, at the Mayo Underwood Auditorium. Again, here's the name Jack K. Robb, who's sponsoring this. And the proceeds are to go to the black hospital in the community, the Winnie A. Scott Hospital, which was located on 2nd Street, not far from where the Corinthian Baptist Church now is. Children. I heard so many stories about children. Many, many, many stories. Love and discipline, concern for children, communities raising their children. One woman said, we were the children of the neighborhood. Every woman was your mother. Every man was your father. It didn't have to be your mama or your daddy to correct you. It could be anyone who caught you doing something wrong. Protectiveness, community involvement, raising children, discipline. Many, many stories about discipline. In the gym, after graduation, you got your diploma, we'd go down for the dance, the prom. And a lot of times, those little girls, their mamas would come and they'd be waiting for the girls. And when the dance was over, the mothers, it was embarrassing to the girls. They'd wait across the street, not meeting their daughters, wait until they got out of school, but they made them come out. The daughters, now, mama sometimes would be up in the balcony waiting for you, which was okay. If you did right, there was no problem. But if you did wrong, mama was down there on that dance floor and you were gone. I have a lady friend, an associate of mine. She was growed up before her father stopped tagging along when she would go to school. She would, and two more girls, they'd be walking, but their daddy was with them every step of the way. Parental discipline. I said to one woman, a lot of people I've talked to said that if you did wrong, you might get a spanking. And she said, oh no, we never got spankings. We got beat. It was a beating, and I mean, Mama would whoop you. She'd let you know who she was, and you better respect who she was. I'm talking to a man, Papa could plait switches, and he'd take great pride in plaiting them switches. He'd put them together, and he'd put them on top of an old water jug, and he'd let them ripen and season. This is a funny little story. About during that time, 3 of us slept in one bed. And whoever got on the high side of the bed, that was good sleeping. Because if you was down in the middle, well, sometimes they'd urinate on you and things like that. You'd get wet. And you'd have to get up in the morning and wash your pajamas. And a lot of us didn't have pajamas. You had to sleep in your underwear and wear them. And then I kept the bed just about 10 inches from the wall. The old man, he'd come in there, and you'd think everything was over. He'd come in there, he'd say, "Well, my young man, you didn't come in like I told you. You didn't do what your mama said about that stove wood. You, James, why didn't you? I'd say, Papa, but, well, here I go out and I work and I slave and I try to have something for you all. And then he'd tie in, he'd pull them covers off. And it was something that you'd done last week that you thought he'd forgot all about. That was that beating too. And I had a way of turning over and rolling off in the bed, get down between the bed and the rest of them. They'd come up with these whelps, but not me. Well, Papa, he was watching me at the table, and I guess he was saying to himself, "Wonder how that boy's missing getting them whelps on him." So one night we'd done something. Papa came back with a switch, and we could look up on the wardrobe and see his shadow coming through the house, out of the bedroom, coming back to see us. You know, we'd get back in that bedroom and we'd get to breaking wind. You know how boys do. And there in the bed, and he'd stand up beside this thing. And that night he came back and I was going down in my hole. And after all these years, he shoved that bed up against the wall. "Now, my young man, you'll look like the rest of them." They were strict. It's surprising to me that there aren't generations of white and black people from the bottom that cannot sit down. These people were strict. But there are many landmarks, many things that we don't have time to talk about, and I know I'm going on real long. The Corinthian Baptist Church on Miro Street. Beautiful, beautiful church. Gorgeous. We have some images in our collection of the interior, but I didn't get a chance to get them copied in time for tonight. The Gas House. And this is a copy. It's a very poor image. It's a copy from a newspaper. I don't know where the original is. I assume it's in the community somewhere. But that fronted onto Miro, but it took up the better part of the block there, and you can see the vats. But it's one of the landmarks that was in existence in the bottom from the 1850s on. This is a shot made in the mid-1960s, an aerial shot of urban renewal. Urban renewal came to Frankfort about 1955 and really got going in 1958. It was a bulldozer-powered renaissance that was going to bring back downtown, and it was sweeping the nation. Almost no subject is as emotional to residents as urban renewal. You talk about the politics of it, the broken promises, the grieving, the displacement, the relocation process. Much, much pain. I was living in a room down in the bottom. We had 2 bedrooms, and there was closets in our apartment. We never had closets much when we lived in the slumlord houses. They didn't have closets. And we had a bathroom and hot and cold water and a nice porch and a yard, and we moved up to the public housing project. It was a 1-bedroom. My daughter and I had to sleep in the same bed together because they put us in a 1-bedroom. And I stood on the porch. I'll never forget it. I stood on the porch and I cried the day I had to move because it was just so small and the room was so small. And I had to put my bed in catacornered in that room because you couldn't put it in flat. A gentleman I talked to, very knowledgeable gentleman. Well, basically what I think, and I actually believe that it was all a cruel mirage. They came in and they painted such a beautiful picture, of how things were going to be so much better. But there was people that suffered 15, 20 years as a result of it. Actually, it broke up families. People were taking sides. The black leadership was totally disrupted. You take what we wound up with in the American Legion over there. We had a building that was put together by blacks. I mean, it was built by a 3-story building, and we wound up with a little hut. And I spoke to this woman. She said, they made us promises. That's what we were looking forward to, those promises. That the government was going to build us homes, that you had 40 years to pay for those homes. And see, that's what hurt the people, because a lot of us were relying on that, and it never did materialize. I told my mother, I said, we'll save our money. We'll save. That's what we'll do. And we'll come back, and we'll buy one of those houses. But it never happened. And that's the only thing we never could understand. What happened to those houses? I was very fortunate to be referred to Miss Nell Cox, Nash Cox's sister, the daughters of Lewis Cox. Nell is a photographer, and she graciously allowed me to borrow many of her photographs, and she had been driving around the bottom in the 1960s. I don't know where some of these buildings are, but I know that they're in the bottom. I have a good hunch on this one. I believe it's on Wilkinson Street. I believe this to be the home of Miss Eva Cox, which would be about where the entrance is to the Holiday Inn on that side of Wilkinson. This building, we can sort of get a hint. Look at the upper right corner. See the cut stone projecting? This is right there on Clinton, adjacent to the Oddfellows in the American Legion building. In the early 1960s, many of the joints were gone or out of business. You can't hardly make this out, but the auction notice on the left is for the Peachtree Inn, Willard Riddle. The auction notice on the right is for the Blue Moon, Grace Sarvin. It's interesting, Willard Riddle never survived the urban renewal project. He was gunned down by his wife, or at least she was charged with it. And Grace, I don't know what became of Grace, but most of the joints in the bottom, there was a few that lasted to the late 60s. Most were gone by the early 1960s. Many of the institutions did not survive. Mayo Underwood was destroyed. What had happened, Mayo had desegregated its high school in the mid-1950s, and it desegregated its elementary in the early 60s. But originally, the urban renewal project was not to include Mayo Underwood. But it did not survive. Some of the institutions did. This, again, it's a sort of a poor image. The man in the center is the Reverend King, and this is the groundbreaking for Corinthian Baptist, which is now over on 2nd and Murray. Beautiful buildings did not survive. And you all may very well remember these buildings, because it provoked quite an outpouring of outrage when these buildings came down. And I always get these two mixed up, so if I'm wrong, holler out. I believe this is the John Marshall Harlan House. I could be wrong. And then the Sharp Beecham House. But if I'm wrong, get with me afterwards and correct me on it. But their destruction was a catalyst for the preservation movement in Frankfort. This is one of the few images I have of the old Oddfellows building. Mr. Keynes over at the electric and water plant allowed me to make a copy of his image. But this is the front of it. You're looking across Washington Street there. Mr. Atkins and the Tiger Inn moved here in 1963 and operated the Tiger Inn up until '68. It was the last place that he was to have his business. Let me just read you one little quote here. It's a letter he sent to the urban renewal officials. He said, "I regret that I will be forced to close my business, which I have operated continuously for the past 37 years, March 15, 1931 to March 15, 1938. But inhibited because of race or finances or inability to find a location that can comply with the sale of malt beverages, I have no alternative." That was one of the longest operating black-owned and operated businesses in Frankfort. A very sad thing to see it go. And there's the auction notice. The American Legion was in the building, and they, of course, lost their facility. All the structures in the 50-acre area were removed. Not one of the urban renewal structures was left. Not until after 7 years of the start of the project in 1958, 7 years later, the first building went back in. And this was typical of urban renewal projects. They were much better on clearing things out than they were on putting things back in. You can barely see, look in the upper right, a little bit right of center, you can see a small yellow brick building. That is the Riverview Public Housing Project. 75 units of public housing were built. Riverview and Sutherland Terrace, which is up on Douglas, I believe. Riverview opened in 67 and Sutherland opened in 62. And of course the tower. The tower stands atop where Mayo Underwood once stood. It was completed in 1972, dedicated that December. And here are some of the current structures on the site. You can see the Farnham-Dudgeon Civic Center. Farnham-Dudgeon, a major mover in the urban renewal project. There's the tower, the hotel. Here we are looking at Miro from the intersection of St. Clair looking west on Miro. If we had stepped back 30 or 40 years, right on that corner there would have been Tony Papa, and 2 doors down from him, Dr. E. Underwood. We could have stopped and gone around behind Tony's and got ourselves an ice cream cone if we'd wanted it. Here we are looking west on Clinton Street from St. Clair again. And here's Wilkeson looking north. The John C. Watts building replaced the John Marshall Harlan and the Solomon Sharp Beecham House. Then the YMCA came in at the corner of Broadway and Wilkeson. And of course the tower itself. The Breathitt administration rescued the urban renewal project. Redevelopment was going poorly. They couldn't get private developers to come in and build housing. Who is going to build housing for low-income people in an area prone to flooding? Is the Army Corps of Engineers going to build you a flood wall for residential housing? No. You have to prove to them that you've got redevelopment potential and you're going to generate money as a result of this flood wall. So they were caught in a vicious circle there, and the dreams and plans for housing never really materialized. The Breathitt administration came into town, and the tower got built, and it really sort of rescued the urban renewal project. There are a few buildings down there that are typical of the area. There's Simon's Furniture at the corner of St. Clair and Miro. And here are just a few little buildings. This is St. Clair, beyond Miro, north of Miro. And this little house here, it would be very typical of a residential dwelling in the bottom. Maybe not in this quite a good shape as this, but you can see it's small and has an L wing coming off the back. And then adjacent to it is a duplex. And this would be at the corner of what would have been Blanton and St. Clair. This is very, very, to me, sort of takes me back. You're looking at what would have been Blanton Street. This building fronts onto the big parking lot that's adjacent to the cave. And you see how narrow and skinny, how small the lot is, the outside stairway leading up to an apartment on the second floor, very reflective of what buildings in the bottom would have been like, and again, maybe not in quite this good a shape. And then the Salvation Army building I told you about earlier that was there. I wanted to leave you with just a few quotes. I know we've had a lot tonight, but there were other institutions besides the buildings. There were characters, people who were loved and well known. Squeezer Brown, Mr. Squeezer. Squeezer, he'd get a bunch of kids and he'd march them, you know. They was in Squeezer's army. They'd march and he'd take them to Tiger's Inn, and that's where the kids hung out mostly. And they'd have a man lock the door, and then anything they wanted in Tiger's Inn. And if they didn't act right now, he'd put them right out. Put them out that door and tell them to go on home to Mama or something. But if they acted right, they'd get pop or ice cream or candy or anything. They say that man spent most of his pension on kids, taking them to different stores, buying them candy and pop and stuff. Squeezer, Now, to have met that man, you'd have loved that man. He'd keep you laughing. He could play the banjo, play the guitar, play the piano. He loved children. He spent his bonus on children. In later years, as he grew older, he went to a home, but he loved to laugh. He had this little song. I saw him one day working on a house, and the sun was high in the sky. And he came down off of that ladder, and he grabbed his guitar, and he started playing, "I don't bother work, and work don't bother me." One day he had so many kids down there, he lined them across the street on Washington all the way down to the little ice house. Had them in the front door and coming out the back. I'd say there's 150 kids, black and white, going in, getting anything they want. Of course, Mr. Atkins didn't have much candy and stuff like that, but he always sold out when Squeezer brought his crew in. Yes, sir, he was a wonderful person. He'd have his uniform, his hat. Sometimes you'd see him in different outfits. Might be in a high hat with tails on. Oh, he was something. Mr. Squeezer was something. And then a story I didn't get recorded, a fellow said he saw Squeezer walking down the street and he saw some kids and he reached in his pocket and pulled out everything he got and just threw it up in the air, scattered it on the ground to him. When you're talking about characters, you've got to talk about John Wallace. And I will leave us tonight with John Wallace, because sometime, maybe a year from now, which means you ought to tell me it's 2 years from now so I can be ready earlier, but we're going to do us a program on John Wallace, because that is a man who is deserving of a mini-series, not a program. And perhaps the next time we meet, we can discuss it. I know I've left out a lot, and I know I've gone on too long, all in the same thing. We could talk about the prisons. We could talk about the rivers. We could talk about the politics. Sometimes the stories would be beautiful. Sometimes they'd be tragic, but they would be stories we would not forget. If there are questions, I'll be glad to try and answer them. Don't forget my sign-up sheet. I would like you all to remember that the bottom was not what a lot of people would tell you that it was. It was a place of love and hope and caring and sharing. Thank you. Great. Uh-oh, there's a question.
Not a question, but a story. I was talking to a lady typing some of these interviews that you had done, and she was telling me she was having a real hard time with this one because of 3 people that you said you were interviewing 3 people. The problem was that you somehow got the first half of the interview on the
I had problems.
this is the half of the interview got on the first part.
This is the first oral history project I ever did.
In the middle of it, and so you didn't necessarily know who all they were, but she said there was 3 people, and they were kind of talking over, and it was hard. And she said, but when she got to the second half of the tape, it got a lot easier, but you figured out that there was actually 4 people you were talking to.
That's normally not the way you do it, but if somebody says, "Honey, come on in here, this man wants to talk to us," and then she brings 2 of her friends, you don't say, "Honey, get on out of here, I don't want to talk to you, I came to talk to him." It's not the best way. I would tell you this, that it was my first project. I shouldn't admit it in public. I recorded over the top of one of my interviews before I realized what I was doing. Tragic. Fortunately, that one I got squared away. But it was great. I mean, it was really fun. It really was. And these people, I went into homes that immaculate, beautiful. I was looking at this woman's antiques, and she said, "These all came out of the bottom." My auntie would work for these wealthy people, and they'd give her furniture that they didn't want. And so it was just amazing to me. Yes?
Is there any chance you would publish this?
I've done 2 papers, and I have one submitted to the Register of the Kentucky Historical Society, which is just on urban renewal. But I hope to do a paper based on these interviews at some point. I don't think it's going to be a book. Somebody else will do the definitive book. I hope this will serve as a catalyst, and maybe one of you all will go out and start doing this kind of thing. Yes, sir?
I read somewhere that the expression, "he came from the wrong side of the track," originated here in Frankfort due to the Craw area. Have you come across that?
I have. Someone told me that same story. And it's one of those things in oral folk legend, and it's almost impossible to verify. But it was on the other side of the tracks. But I found no evidence that we could lay claim, that Frankfort could lay claim to that particular phrase. Yes, ma'am?
There were some books up there, at the city directory there, and I was wondering if there any way we could get copies or one that was particularly interesting.
Yeah, all of the materials, I'm glad you brought that up. I shouldn't say all, most of the materials are from the Research Library of the Kentucky Historical Society, which is located in the Old Capitol Annex. We're open 6 days a week, and we can copy parts of the directories. By the way, if you come up and use the maps and you want to look up a particular address, go to the directory, look alphabetically under the street name and find the number, and you can find out who's living there. I'm glad you brought that up. Anybody else? Jeez, oh Pete's. I didn't realize they're gone. Yes? Oh, man. Would you let me copy that sometime? Whoa, tonight has been worth it. Oh, that's great. Great. Will Castleman. Oh, what a character. Good.
I'm thinking now in terms of my late wife. When she went to South Frankfort and was going out to Dodge, she was uneasy sometimes until she got across the railroad track over and Craw.
I heard somebody else tell me that story. They said, I never felt safe till I got to Craw.
I was wondering too, is there a place in the museum down here that is, for 15 years since I've been in, we used to be in every Sunday, or almost every day, visiting when we were children. And I was wondering if there's anything there, that covers,
No, that explains that. Our exhibits stop at the year 1900, but we do have temporary gallery space, and one of the things we have on the drawing board is a plan to do a temporary exhibit on this subject. I'd like to see a full-blown Frankfort exhibit with a portion of it being on this. I'd love to walk into the Tiger Inn, a recreated Tiger Inn, and have somebody portraying Mr. Atkins to talk to you about what the Tiger Inn was like. That would be wonderful. You all worn down? I hope so. I am.
Well, PBS and the Civil War has Ken Burns, and Frankfort in the bottom have Jim Wallace. I'd like to thank you all for coming, and we have a meeting in November, and our topic in November is going to be how Frankfort became and remained the state capital. So I hope you all will come back in November. Thank you all very much.